How are you preserving these rituals? How are you bringing them, making sure they're fresh, that they're still impactful for people now?
So our mission is to empower, educate, and train the Chevra Kadisha, these folks who are really doing this holy and sacred work within their Jewish communities across North America. And the honor and comfort in our name are these core values, these core tenets that we hold really dear as part of the work of Chevra Kadisha.
This is the Buried in Work podcast, where we share tips and interview experts to help you simplify estate planning and end-of-life tasks.
Welcome to today's episode. I'm 𝘎𝙬𝙙𝙙. Joining us today, Sarit Vyshnevsky, who's the Executive Director of Kavod 𝙀𝙀𝙙-𝙀𝙀. Sarit is leading the charge. She's working with Jewish communities on end-of-life rituals, taking these rituals from that have quite thousands of years of history and making sure that they connect with people in this modern world. Sarit, thank you so much for spending some time with us today on the Buried in Work podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about the work that you're doing. How are you preserving these rituals? How are you bringing them, making sure they're fresh, that they're still impactful for people now?
Awesome. Yeah. So if it's okay, I'm going to start with the name because I think I want to just make sure that people have an understanding of what our name is all about.
Please.
Kavod v'nichum is Hebrew. Kavod is honor. Nichum is comfort. And these are two of the core tenets of the Chevra Kadisha. Chevra Kadisha translates directly to holy friends, but more commonly known as the Jewish Burial Society or the Sacred Society or the Holy Society. And these are the groups of typically volunteers in communities who care for the deceased and comfort the living. And so our mission is to empower, educate, and train the Chevra Kadisha, these folks who are really doing this holy and sacred work within their Jewish communities across North America. And the honor and comfort in our name are these core values, these core tenets that we hold really dear as part of the work of Chevra Kadisha.
When you are working in community, you're in New Jersey. What is the community like, and how has it changed in the time that you've been a steward of it?
Yeah, so Kavod v'nichum is about 24 years old. I've been the executive director for the past 3 years. We're a national organization focusing on the United States and Canada. And we've seen a real growth in the organization itself, as well as in the Chevra Kadisha movement, which is really how we talk about it. We focus on communities, typically in pluralistic communities, and welcome across all denominations of Jewish culture. Denominations within Judaism really refer to the level of observance of ritual, right? So you may have Orthodox Chevra Kadisha, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, post-denominational. We have what we call geographic Chevra Kadisha or community Chevra Kadisha, which is when they are serving a geographic area as opposed to being attached to a specific synagogue, which is another way in which Chevra Kadisha show up. And what we've really seen, there's an ebb and flow to the engagement of Chevra Kadisha. And so we track back, and it's interesting. The values and the where these rituals and practices come from, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about what those rituals and practices are. But where they come from, they stem from text and tradition that is really old, and yet we really only trace back modern Chevra Kadisha about it's not that long. We had the first recorded book that codified the work of Chevra Kadisha is in the 1600s. We're actually coming up on the 400th anniversary, so 1626. This book was written in Italy, in Modena, Italy, called Ma'avar Yabok, and it's crossing the Jabbok River, and it is a dense and fascinating book that really is the first time we see writings about how these groups of people within communities, the liturgy and the movements that they are doing in these rituals and practices, like written down. And so for all intents and purposes, Chevra Kadisha as a concept is pretty modern, but the values and the way that community shows up at the time of death to both care for the deceased and comfort the living, those are really ancient values that we can trace back. In the United States, we've seen we trace around the culture of Judaism and Jewish practice. And so we've seen these shifts happen throughout, the last couple hundred years about how we show up. And we have changed how we live, right? And so when we used to live in big cities, when we used to, right, everyone was together, you had that kind of more old world approach of family and everyone, you wouldn't move away, right? It felt really different. There was a whole different way of being and a whole different way of showing up. The rituals and practices were still there, but the formula of Chevra Kadisha looked a little bit different, that structure. When we start tracing through the 1900s, we kind of see a disconnect happen as people start moving out to suburbs, modern synagogue life starts to happen. And it isn't until the 1970s that we begin to see this like reconnection with Chevra Kadisha, and more Chevra Kadisha start to pop up. And what's really interesting is within our Orthodox communities, they've always existed because they're part of a framework. And when we started seeing other denominations come into really rise into being, so conservative Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism, we began to pick and choose a little bit more. And because of that, many of our communities, I'm a conservative Jew, we lost a connection to some of these practices and ways of being. And we would turn to our Orthodox siblings, family, right? And they would come when somebody died to offer the services of Chevra Kadisha, to engage in these rituals. And now we're seeing, especially in the last 20 years, especially in the last 5 years, right? The pandemic has really shifted a lot. We're seeing a lot more people reaching out to say, hey, how can I be a part of this? This is amazing. I want to care for the people who are in my community. And this is a really tangible way of doing that and showing up and being a part. So we're seeing a lot more people really come back into it.
I'm thinking about the timeline. You said you've been the executive director for the last 3 years. And of course, that overlaps pretty neatly with some of those, kind of the end of the early pandemic, if we can talk about it that way. And I'm thinking about the funerals that didn't feel like funerals, the Shiva on Zoom, or, just a part of some of these, and just seeing it and trying to translate it and understand it and feel it the way we're supposed to feel it. How do you have that honor? How do you have that community with all the rules kind of thrown up in the air? Because this isn't unique, this moment, but it certainly is different than almost anything that we've seen come before it. And how do you then take some lessons from that and apply it to whatever's coming next?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. Right? I think the pandemic upended a lot of things for a lot of people, and many of us are still grieving the loss of community at that
Yeah.
time and figuring out, right, like how to rebuild. For Chevra Kadisha, before I share, I think the role of the pandemic in the bonds and the community, I want to explain that the role of Chevra Kadisha is really about being present, and it's about a physical presence. The two core rituals of the Chevra Kadisha practices, one is called tahara, one is called shmira. Shmira comes from the root shomer, which means to watch or to guard over. And this is back to an ancient practice of when things went bump in the night, right? It comes from actually a really practical place. So, and we know that it's not the case. In many of our communities, we still have to guard against things that go bump in the night. But when you check back, a few hundred years, even before refrigeration, before we were, keeping decedents in buildings overnight, you would need to have someone guard the body to make sure that animals, right, from desecration, from other human beings, just to really be a guard. And now with modern innovations and technology, in some ways we are still a physical guard, but we're also a spiritual guard, right? And so the ritual in Judaism, the tradition is to not let anyone be alone from the time of death until burial or final disposition. We sit there, and Judaism also, there are a lot of different thoughts about where the soul is in that moment, right? So if you believe in the soul, some people believe that the soul is still present until final disposition. And so that could be a confusing time, right? Could we provide comfort to the soul by being there, by reading? There's traditional readings that you can do, reading Psalms or reading books that explore death or end of life or Jewish tradition and text. I think as long as we talk a lot about of intention, as long as the intention is there and on the decedent. And so many communities, you take shifts, or sometimes one person sits for 12 hours and is there in the building with the decedent, and that's shmira. And it's also a comfort to the living, right? To know that your loved one is not alone, and that someone is there dedicating themselves to being present and being aware for both the decedent and for their loved ones. And then the second core ritual is called tahara, which comes from a word which roughly translates it translates to pure, to purify. It is not the strongest translation of the word, and if we had more time I would love to get into it, but maybe I could dangle that carrot and people will want to learn more and come talk with us. But it is this beautiful ritual of washing and dressing and casketing the deceased. And it's a 4-part ritual performed by a team of people who lovingly honor and care for the deceased by reciting certain liturgy that accompanies certain movements. And there's a physical washing, a spiritual washing, a dressing in white burial garments. We dress in very plain white garments, no metal, no zippers, nothing like that, no buttons. And if the person is having grand burial, casket the deceased. And it is all done with the utmost care and love and respect. And these are really the last hands to touch this person. And so those 2 core rituals are central to being part of a Chevra Kadisha. And then there are other rituals like visiting the bereaved, making that Shiva call, right? So you talked about Zoom Shiva, that came up, but being able to comfort mourners, to comfort the bereaved, to cook for people, right? To clean, to check in whatever ways, right? The physical showing up at however we can do that. And so the pandemic, right, really interrupted these mimetic practices. And I think it opened other doors, right? So on one hand, we had our Chevra Kadisha that were feeling the real loss to be part of the Chevra Kadisha, to be together in the room, right? To wave goodbye to one person as you're exiting your time sitting shmirah, to the next person coming in, to be on a team together caring for a deceased person, like that. Those were put on pause. Many Chavre did the best that they could, right? We had limited knowledge. We upped our PPE. We had to think about how are we directing people to stay safe. The biggest concern, in the beginning, we didn't know, right? Is that could we get it from a deceased person?
Right.
It turns out, right, the bigger concern was from the living, right? And thankfully, we actually wear PPE consistently, regardless of whether or not there's a global pandemic happening, which is really important. But many put on pause, right? Because we didn't have the answers. And we turned to other ways to show up. So some folks started to sit shmirah on Zoom, right? If I can't physically be in the building, could I spend that time directing my energy and my thoughts to this person? Or could I sign up for a shift and sit shmirah at home if it's a spiritual, accompaniment, that sort of thing. And then, of course, we weren't able to be there for our communities in that way. So I think a lot of that disruption still sits for a lot of people. Like we think back, it's very sad, right? And these are people that we think about often, right? The structure of grief and mourning and loss, and still navigating through that. And then, where we come to now is a renewed commitment for a lot of people to taking care of one another. I think the pandemic also highlighted for so many people who are in a Chevra Kadisha, people who are not yet in a Chevra Kadisha, about the value of time. Right? When all of a sudden we began to think about mortality, we began to think about, well, how am I actually spending my life? We began to consider, right, what are those things that we're going to invest in? And as more people became comfortable talking about mortality, began learning about Chevra Kadisha, we've seen a surge of people who are like, actually, this feels so important to me. I want to be in this, and I want to dedicate my time to that. And so it's opened up a lot of doors and windows for sure.
I think about that dynamic of focusing on death or having disruptions around these rituals of death really does remind us of how precious, life is. The idea that every one of these lives is an entire world, that we have this environment that doesn't always respect that or care. It can feel really callous out there sometimes. And that reminder, I want to ask you about, because this is for buried in work people, and we're thinking about how to incorporate that. I want to talk about how people who are thinking, oh, I need Chevra Kadisha in my life, I need these principles or I need these rituals, either because somebody else wants them or because this aligns with my values. But before we talk about those values, I have to ask, because you put this bug in my ear. You've been working on this and you focus on these end-of-life rituals. How has this changed how you spend your time? How does this work inform the life that you're living every day? Because I imagine, as somebody who thinks about this and cares about this and puts a lot of intellectual, emotional, spiritual effort into it, you've probably changed your day-to-day in ways that are really small. And I'd love if you could share those, because I bet people might take something away from that.
That's such a beautiful question, Jared. Thank you. I'm actually going to start with like a few years before joining Kavod v'Nichum, right? Because I think anyone would rightly assume the connection to end-of-life conversations started right before at some point. And the truth is, like, I think I've always been curious about talking about end of life. And I worked with a lot of populations of people who were naturally at the end of their lives. I was by my grandparents' bedside when they died. I learned about becoming an end of life doula, or I learned about end of life doulas, and immediately decided I had to become one because it spoke to me so deeply to learn about the role of a person in those moments. It was so powerful. And that was in 2018 or 2019. I've lost track of time. I learned about it. I did the training and I wasn't ready to step into that world. But the real driver was the birth of my child. So I have one child. She was born in May 2020. And I realized that in her birth and coming to this world, and I named her for my grandfather, who I was at his bedside when he died, that I called in a lot of memory and ancestor, and it was an inhale and an exhale, right? It's this two sides of the same coin, life and death. And in those moments, in the height of everything in 2020, I'm realizing, how am I going to talk to my kid about these things, right? I have to teach someone else. And I ended up leaving the full-time work I was doing at the time, which I really loved. I left at the end of that year to dive in and to learn more, because and a deep part of my identity is also in the Jewish professional world, and thinking really intentionally about Jewish community, and specifically about a lot of the ancient traditions that we have, but how do we connect them to a modern world?
Yeah.
Right? How does this maintain and retain meaning and nourishment for me in my life as it is? And I had got a lot of curiosity around, well, what do we do for the dying? That was my my design question. And I started diving in and very quickly met a lot of the people who are doing this work, who are at also Kavod v'Nichum. And I realized this was the merger of two things that I cared so much about. One was end of life conversations, and on the other hand, Jewish community. And what's changed for me since stepping into this work is really an awareness of the moments, right? And that may be because I have a 4-year-old, and like, every it's you watch them grow so fast, but because I always hold my mortality kind of like so closely. And I don't think of it as morbidity, right? Like, to me, it's just it's life giving. It reminds me it's precious, and I get to be here, and that's a gift. And how I use my time is a gift, hopefully, to the people that I can share that with. And so I'm very conscious about my time. I'm very boundaried with my time, because I need to make sure that I have that balance. And I think that it's brought, for me at least, with people that have died, especially since I've been in this work, I have been feeling more prepared for death, and I've been feeling more calm, which is also a tremendous blessing. I think, for anyone, regardless of faith or, where you come, but there is so much unknown at end of life. And so we have to create roadmaps where it may feel unnavigable. And it doesn't always change the pain, right? It won't change the magnitude of loss, or how, those huge holes in our hearts and souls. But there's a difference when it feels out of control and hard and painful, to when it feels calmer and still hard and painful. And that can be a deciding piece, right, in those moments. And it's not about making it easier, right? But the but to be calm or to be chaotic. And being in this work has led to much greater calm.
I mean, calm as a parent of a 4-year-old, I can relate. You'll take any calm you can get. I also have a 4-year-old, so I can anywhere, any port in this storm. But I imagine, what are the questions that have been toughest for you to answer about hard things that your 4-year-old has given you? Because they're amazing at asking the most pointed, challenging questions. Usually, I imagine when you're either driving or cooking or something else, but I certainly know my wife tends to get them. In fact, just maybe a couple weeks ago, she got one as we were walking past a cemetery, and that was the an hour on death and dying. So I have to know, what are the questions that have been hardest for you to answer from the 4-year-old, who is the best interviewer? I can hold no candle to, I'm sure, the best interviewer you've experienced recently.
That's amazing. And I think there's a lot of value in being vulnerable. And so I'm gonna tell you, and
Yeah.
my eyes might get wet. But my partner's grandmother died about a month ago. She was 103 years old.
Wow.
She lived in
Wow.
her own apartment up
Good.
until the very end. And my daughter, like such a blessing, got to know her, right? Like when we said Grandma Pearl, Dara knew who Grandma Pearl was. We'd been in her apartment, we have photos, we would talk up to her on the phone because we were video chatting this
Yeah.
amazing woman up until near the very end. And we had to sit down and tell her, because we were going to pay a Shiva call. She didn't come with us to the funeral just because of timing. But to tell her that Grandma Pearl had died. And this was the first time that we were going to tell our child that someone that she knew
Hmm.
and had a close relationship with was dead. And we sat down and we had talked about like exactly what we were going to say, and we planned to be really straightforward and allow her to ask the questions and the space to process. And she said, "So does this mean you're going to die?"
Yeah.
And we said, "Not for a really long time." And she said, "I don't want my parents to die."
Right. Right.
And that was such right? When that question comes, right? When you are, and in that moment, I realized I wasn't just confronting like, my fear, right? Like, or her fear rather, of people that she loves one day not being here, but my fear of leaving her.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is real. And also we can't bury that. No pun
No.
intended, right? Like
No.
we have to,
No.
we have to allow that to be a truth that we live with, no matter how painful or hard. And maybe
Yeah.
it's a really, really long time from now. I was on a panel at South by Southwest this year. Incredibly, we had a whole conversation at South by Southwest about communal death care. And the way that we opened the conversation was a question that had been asked on a related panel the year before around, how do I get people to come to my funeral? Like someone had gotten up and asked that question, right? What a question to ask. And I love that question. I love being able to start from there. Because my answer for me and the answer for the work that I do, and I think something maybe a lot of people might think about also is, the truth is, I don't care who shows up to my funeral, right?
Right.
I care who shows up for my loved ones. Like, I'm
Hmm.
going to care who's going to show up to care for the people after. Like, I'm
Yeah.
dead. What do I care?
Right.
But
You've
like, who's
cashed
gonna
in.
who's gonna take care of the
Yeah.
people who I
Oh, that's
know
beautiful.
will have a Sarit-shaped hole in their lives?
Yeah. And that anguish that we're both feeling is behind so much of the pain, the anxiety, the fear that surrounds this issue that these traditions can attempt to buttress against sufficiently, hopefully. So then I'll turn to the question I alluded to before, which was, for people who are trying to understand, oh, somebody I am, my relative who's preparing for end of life may need this kind of ritual, or I might want to consider this somebody who's, hey, you know what, maybe my amount of religiosity has changed over the years. For whom of us hasn't it? But I just imagine for people who are assessing these questions, how do you make the value proposition to them that this is something they should do, and that this is something or that their family member might want?
I think that's a really beautiful question, and one that's really central to our communities, because for many of the groups that we work with, we're choosing this. This is an opportunity, right? Many of us, we're picking and choosing ways in which we're showing up Jewishly, from a place of our faith and our identities every day. And if you have to choose this, right, and you don't have maybe the connection, isn't constant, or you may have, your own judgments on your connection or whatever that looks like, right? Like, that's what a great question, right? Like, what is the value proposition? I think the value proposition is in community, and in the values that many of us share
Yeah.
around love and making sure that people aren't alone and caring for each other, caring for your neighbors. It can't be built top down, right? It has to be built from the people within. And so much of the work that we're doing, right, is about people holding other people. And so the value is like, may the last hands to touch the person that you love, like, be people who are in your community, right? Let people support you. Here's a framework for how to navigate this time that many of us find that completely unnavigable, where there aren't so many guides and books. And I know the world is changing in the best possible ways. Within the Jewish culture, we've had this framework for so long. Let's tap into it. Like, let's let that buttress us. Let's let that support us.
How much would somebody who is planning a funeral, thinking about a funeral, how much would that represent or be recognizable from a Italian book 400 years ago? I mean, how much of that is consistent? How much of it has changed?
So much of it is consistent.
That's beautiful.
It's very simple, right? We're talking about, at the core, a group of people. We're talking about water. We're talking about simple burial garments, and we're talking about a casket, right? Those, and within that, there are movements, and there's liturgy.
Mhm.
And what's really interesting, and this gets into a little bit of the the how I built this, right, in Judaism, is it's something we call minhag. Minhag means tradition. In Judaism, you have minhag and you have halacha, and halacha is law. None of this is actually halacha. None of this is law. So because it came later, because it wasn't something that our sages of the Talmud and the Torah, like, well, of the Talmud, wrote about. It didn't exist in this way. It grew from tradition, and the traditions vary. Not, I wouldn't say like wildly, right? They share core, but they really do differ from community to community, within denomination, from country to country. They can differ. It's a really beautiful thing, right? Because it's driven by community. This is not, the rabbi isn't in the room. These are individuals in the community. You develop this together. You follow a structure, right? That is very recognizable, but maybe the tune is different. Maybe the blessing is a little bit different.
Sure.
Maybe the order of the clothing as you put it on is a little bit different, or the knots that you tie are slightly different. That's how we show up, right? We call it minhag hamakom, the tradition of the place. And so very few will have the exact same as someone else, right? And that is absolutely okay.
Yeah.
And like, to give permission, there is no right way, which I think is so important to hold when it comes to these practices.
I think that's beautiful, and I love the ability to both see that thread through the years, but also acknowledge that, look, we're going to have to do it a little bit differently now, just because of world events or just the place that we're in
Well, a
or what.
great example is the changing liturgy too. 400 years ago, we weren't talking about non-binary, right? We weren't
Mm-hmm.
talking about pronouns, and the liturgy is very binary.
Mm-hmm.
It's very gendered, right? You have women and you have men, and that was it. And that worked until, as a society, we started to acknowledge people who have always been with us, and started inviting people into conversations and growing and stretching. And now we're in a place where we're thinking about non-binary liturgy,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're thinking about non-binary teams to come together to do tahara, because everybody deserves to have the experience and the respect and the love in the way that is meaningful to them, and it follows their wishes.
Yeah.
So the nature of Judaism as a whole, right, as a living religion, and this in particular being a living tradition, really allows for those moments of pivot and change. Yeah.
I love that. And, as somebody who, we have these conversations, and I think there's this kind of mustiness that people associate with the entire topic, whether it's, in a
Mm,
religious context or just, just the cobwebs that surround the conversation that we try to help with Buried in Work. It's like, no, this is fresh and new, and we're going to do it in a way that helps. And I, I find that enormously valuable and powerful, and I hope that other people can see that as well, because it does do a lot to combat that fear, that pit, that the anxiety and the fear that can live in our heart, and frankly is totally natural, but
yeah.
that's why we have each other. And I'm so grateful for you today, being, this conversation. You talk about being respectful of boundaries and time. We're coming to the end of this conversation. I am just so grateful that you've spent some of it with me and with the people who listen to this conversation at Buried in Work. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you, Jared. It was really a pleasure, and I appreciate your thoughtful and insightful questions. Glad to be in a space where we could have real conversation.
Me too. Me too. And for people who want to follow the work that Sarit is doing, and it's Sarit Vyshnevsky, and it's the website. We're going to put this in the description of the episode so that people can make sure to get the spelling right. But for people who want to see the work that you're doing at Kavod Nikyum, Vidnikyum, my, I knew
It
that
is
there was going to
deep
be some.
Hebrew.
I knew I was going to get caught on some of these shibboleths
Do
today.
you want me to do that one? I can do
Please,
that one.
could you tell people where the website is so that
Yeah,
the
come visit
non-Jew in
us.
this conversation can take the coupon?
Kavod V'nichum. We're at KAV as in Victor, OD, V as in Victor, NICHUM.org.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate that. And people should see the work that you're doing. If it's valuable to incorporate in the work that your loved ones or you or your loved ones are thinking about, you can try to incorporate that. It's North America. It's global, and we can share those resources as widely as possible. I'm 𝘬𝙧𝙙. I've been so grateful for the time today. Thank you for listening to Buried in Work.